Shalom. First off, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahawah Harkodash. I want to give double honors to the apostles and elders of GMS who have taught us this word and teach us this word today. And I want to give a salutation unto the elect of the nation of Israel. This is the brother Yatazakba with the GMS Nebraska camp. This is GMS Endeavor. And in this lesson, what I want to go into is the Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 15. How this woman was actually an Israelite. And I want to basically break down this account in the scriptures proving that this woman is an Israelite, because when you get into this with how Yahushua initially reacted to the woman and how the woman is described, it can bring a level of confusion to where it can seem like this woman was a heathen. But once you break it down, you understand that that's not so. So let's get into it. Matthew chapter 15, verse 22, which says, "And behold, a woman of Canaan came out of the same coast and cried unto him, saying, Have mercy on me, O Lord, thou son of David. My daughter is grievously vexed with the devil. But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and besought him, saying, Send her away, for she crieth after us. But he answered and said, I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And right there, that would make it seem like she was a heathen. Because at first Yahushua ignored her, and he said, I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But what we have to understand is that in this time, when the gospel is being preached, Yahushua and the disciples were only going unto the Israelites that knew they were Israelites, that knew they were Jews, that was raised up in the customs. Because when you go to Matthew chapter 10 and verse 5, it says, These 12 Yahushua sent forth and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, and into any city of the Samaritans enter ye not, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So while Yahushua was what was still around, they were only going into the Israelites that were in the know, that knew about the law, that were keeping the customs. But when you go to Matthew chapter 28, after Yahushua was resurrected and he was going with his Father in heaven, it says Matthew chapter 28 verse 18, and Yahushua came and spake unto them, saying, All power is given unto me in heaven and in earth. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. So that was the time to where the disciples being turned into apostles will be commissioned to go into all nations. And when it says all nations, it's not saying the Gentiles by blood, the actual heathen. It's saying the Israelites that were mingled amongst the heathen. Because what we have to understand is that you had Israelites that grew up in the customs of these different nations around them, to where they were basically heathen. Just like before we received the truth, when we were in the world, keeping the customs of the world, not knowing that we were Israelites, knowing anything about our heritage, we were essentially just Americans, and so you had the same thing going on back then in this time. And so when Yahushua was still preaching the gospel, it wasn't the time to go to them until Yahushua went away. And that's when you have in Acts, you read about in Acts chapter 2, how the apostles was teaching unto the Jews under every nation under heaven, speaking in their different languages. This is why you had Paul, going and doing his mission, going all around, to the different lands and teaching the Israelites who were in these different lands, because that was the time to go into the Israelite Gentiles. But when we go to Matthew chapter 15, that time hadn't came yet. So that's why Yahushua had initially reacted like that and said what he said. As well as, let's go to Mark chapter 7, because this same account is in Mark chapter 7, but it describes the woman from Canaan in a different fashion. Let's go to it. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 25, which says, For a certain woman whose young daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him, and came and fell at his feet. the woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by nation, and she besought him that he would cast forth the devil out of her daughter. So here it's saying that she was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by nation, but in Matthew it called her a woman of Canaan. Now, before we break this down in Mark chapter 7, when we go back to Matthew 15 and 22, and we go into that word Canaan, where it calls her a woman of Canaan, it's Strong's G 5478, which says, in Yahushai's time, a Phoenician, right? So let's go back to Mark chapter 7, what was it, verse 25 or verse 26? It says the woman was a Greek, a Syrophoenician by nation. So before we get into the Greek part, it says that she was a Syrophoenician by nation, which when we break this word down, Syrophoenician, let's get the Phoenician aspect first, which is Strong's G 5403, which is Phoenicia, land of palm trees, a territory of the province of Syria, situated on the coast of the Mediterranean. So basically, she came out of the land of Phoenicia, which would also be called Canaan. And Phoenicia was in the Syrian province. So someone from this territory or from this land would have been called a Syrophoenician. The same way, like Paul, for example, he was a Roman citizen, but Paul wasn't an Edomite. He was just a Roman citizen. So a citizen from this land that the woman came from would have been described as a Syrophoenician. It's not calling her a Canaanite. It's not calling her a Phoenician. That's just where she was born. Now, it also identifies her, or I won't necessarily say that's where she was born, but that's where she was, that's where she came out of. I can't necessarily say she was born there. Well, it does say here in the NLT, she was born in Syrian Phoenicia, so yeah. But let's get into the aspect here when it calls her a Greek, which is Strong's G 1674, which is Hellenis, which is a Greek woman, right? So this is the feminine version of the word Helen, Strong's G 1672, which is a Greek either by nationality, whether a native of the mainland or of the Greek islands or colonies. It says, in a wider sense, the name embraces all nations, not Jews, which right here, when it says not Jews, they're going off here. Let's ignore this part. And we're about to get some history, which is showing that this part is off, where they say not Jews. But it says, in a wider sense, the name embraces all nations that made the language, customs, and learning of the Greeks their own. The primary reference is to a difference of religion and worship. So what it's saying here is that a person will be called Greek even if they aren't an Edomite, even if they aren't a Greek by blood. They will be called a Greek because they adopted the Greek fashion. And we know when we go into the history of First Maccabees, our people did that. That's why you had Hellenistic Jews. Let's go to First Maccabees chapter 1, and we're going to go down to verse 10. It says, and there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus surnamed Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been a hostage at Rome, and he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. In those days went there out of Israel wicked men who persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So what you had going on at this time, Antiochus was the king, and he had dominance over us at Jerusalem. So what you had people doing, you had Israelites that were basically what Antiochus was doing is that he made it basically illegal to be a Jew. He made it illegal for us to keep our customs, for us to keep the law, for us to worship the Most High Yahweh. What Antiochus did is that he would force us to follow the Greek fashion. We had to follow his religion. We had to eat pork. We had to basically leave off of our ways. And if we didn't, he was putting people to death. And so what you had Israelites doing was that they was just getting down with the program. Because when you read on, it says, like it said, it says, let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us. For since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So this device pleased them well. Then certain of the people were so forward herein that they went to the king, who gave them license to do after the ordinances of the heathen. So what was they doing? It says, whereupon they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem, according to the customs of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. So they took on the Greek fashion. And this was a big cultural thing amongst our people, to where you had a lot of our people who took on the Greek fashion. They started wearing Greek clothing. They started speaking Greek. They started taking on the Greek mindset of worshiping the different gods and, doing the things within Greek culture. And then you had some of our people who stuck to, our way, the way of the Israelites. But for those who took on the Greek culture, when they had kids, that's how they taught their kids. They taught their kids, the Greek fashion. And then they taught their kids the Greek fashion, to where once you get into the time of Yahushua and the disciples, you had our people that's all they knew. All they knew was the Greek fashion. And this is why when Yahushua was resurrected, he sent the disciples out to teach, our people who were following these different, heathens' ways, to basically, stir up their pure minds by way of remembrance, basically giving them the gospel, like, this isn't who you are. This isn't your way. Come back and repent and turn from that. The same thing that happened here in America with our nation. So that's why this woman was described as a Greek, because she grew up in that fashion, but she had faith in Yahushua. And so when we go back to Matthew chapter 15, so Salaki, Lord's will, this isn't confusing, so let's read on. In Matthew 15, we're going to go to verse 25. It says, then came she and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me. So let's keep in mind, she came up the first time, Yahushua, he basically kind of shunned her, but she was still persistent. And once she said something the second time, Yahushua said, but he answered and said, it is not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it to dogs. Now, from this part, it would still make you think, that this woman is a heathen, for him to call her a dog. But again, we have to keep in mind, in this time, Yahushua was only going unto our people who were following after the customs, who was keeping the ways. So that's why he says not meet to take the children's bread and to cast it to dogs. When we go into the definition of this word dogs, it's Strong's G2952, which just says a little dog. But when we go into this root here, Strong's G2965, it's a metaphor for a man of an impure mind, an impudent man. And when we go into the etymology of impudent, it's without shame, shameless, not ashamed, not modest, impure. So this is basically representing our people who turned from, the ways that the Most High gave us, that set us apart from the nations, that made us holy. That's why, what does it say in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 2? It says, for thou art an holy people unto the Lord Yahweh thy power, and the Lord had chosen thee to be a peculiar people unto himself above all the nations that are upon the earth. When you go into that word holy, is basically sacred, set apart, basically pure. And what made us that way is because the Lord gave us the law. When we was keeping the law, when we was following after, the law, the Lord's law, statutes, and commandments, it made us pure. It made us set apart from all these nations around us. But when you had our nation getting into the Greek fashion or any of the heathens' ways, following after their gods, they weren't pure anymore. They weren't set apart anymore. And this is why the Lord called, basically referred to her as a dog, which was a metaphor for an impure person. Because, those who was following after that Greek way, they weren't set apart by the ways that the Lord gave us anymore. So, as a matter of fact, that's not the only place where the Lord referred to our people as dogs. That's why when you go to Matthew chapter 7, verse 6, it says, give not that which is holy unto the dogs, neither cast ye your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn again and rend you. This is speaking about our people when Yahweh Shai said this. When you read it in the NLT, it says, don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. They will trample the pearls and then turn and attack you. And what this is saying is that don't be preaching the word to, wicked people that don't want nothing to do with the word. This refers to even the time that we're in now. We're not supposed to be going out and breaking our neck to teach any and everybody, because this truth ain't for any and everybody. You got 2/3, amongst our nation that's not going to repent, that's not going to turn and get into their right mind. The Lord gave them over to a reprobate mind. And when you get the etymology of that word reprobate, it says rejected as worthless, disapprove, reject, condemn. Abandoned in character, morally depraved, unprincipled. A reprobate right here says one rejected by the Most High, person given over to sin. So that's why they were referred to as swine, as dogs, as unclean animals, because these were Israelites that couldn't be washed by the pure word. They were 2/3. They were basically on the outside. So when we go back to Matthew 15, let's finish up this account with the woman. She replied to Yahweh Shai, it says, and she said, truth, Lord, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table. So the woman was being humble. She kept on beseeching the Lord, asking for his help. It says, then Yahweh Shai answered and said unto her, O woman, great is thy faith, and be it unto thee even as thou wilt. And her daughter was made whole from that very hour. This woman's faith was so strong that even though it wasn't the time yet for the Lord and the disciples to be going unto the Gentiles of the Israelites, he still had compassion on her, because she was being contrite, she was being humble, she was being faithful. And so the Lord basically rewarded that by helping the woman's daughter. You can contrast this to the Samaritan woman, the woman at the well, where the woman at the well came unto the Lord with the same faith. The woman at the well believed that the Lord was the Son of Man, but the Lord wasn't dealing with her. Why? Because she was an actual heathen. That Samaritan woman was one of those heathen that were switched out with the Israelites back in the time of the Assyrian captivity. You can read about that in 1 Kings, I believe, chapter 16. So it shows a difference with, Yahweh Shai was apprehensive with this woman at first. He wasn't dealing with her at first, but we have to understand what Yahweh Shai's mission was at the time. And we have to go into the different descriptions that it gives of this woman to understand that these were just different descriptive things to describe an Israelite, in the culture at the time, not just describing a heathen. So Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. Once again, I want to give all praise, honor, and glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahawah Charkadash. I want to give double honors to the apostles and elders of GMS, and a salutation unto the elect. Shalom.